Hello and welcome to Tattvadeep Conversations and Explorations. For our ninth episode on biology, we sat down with Professor Amitabh Joshi. Professor Joshi is an Indian evolutionary biologist, population ecologist, geneticist, and a professor at the Jawaharlal Nehru Centre for Advanced Scientific Research. In 2009, the Council of Scientific and Industrial Research, the apex agency of the Government of India for Scientific Research, awarded him the Shanti Swarup Bhatnagar Prize for Science and Technology, one of the highest Indian science awards, for his contributions to biological sciences. He is an ardent poet and writes poetry in Urdu, Persian, and English. He has recited poetry in public and private gatherings in multiple cities in India, as well as in Germany, USA, and Afghanistan. And he has also given lectures on the history of Urdu poetry in the Indian subcontinent and the life and work of Allama Iqbal. We talked about what is biology, what is evolutionary biology, about population genetics, how to articulate a question, how poetry and science might be the same thing, if science can tell us about the nature of reality, what poetry and philosophy can tell us about reality, and how Professor Joshi's understanding of biology has influenced his worldview. We hope this conversation can help the listeners see the tattva, or the true essence of biology, and its potential to help us understand how life came to be and the various ways in which it evolves with and through humans as well as all other living beings. Hello, Professor Joshi. Welcome to Tattvadeep.
Hi.
So, to get things started for us, I'd like to ask you a very fundamental question, actually, a few fundamental questions. So, my first question to you is, what is biology?
Briefly, biology is a study of the living world, the part of the world that consists of all the different life forms that we call species, different types of animals, plants, microbes, fungi. So biology as a science would be that which tries to understand the irregularities we see in this living world and build up some explanations for why it is the way it is. For example, unusual things as compared to non-living things of physical objects. They have all kinds of properties, including those of growth, of reproduction, of responding in very clear ways to changes in the environment and so on. So there are all these properties that biology is to try to understand what makes a living thing alive. What is it that makes other part of biology, which is sometimes relatively neglected. For example, we immediately notice that there's a great diversity of species. The world is not just covered with one kind of bacterium or one kind of plant or something like that. There's this huge diversity, so that needs explanation. Also, the diversity is not random in that we can lump together different species based on differing degrees of similarity in how they appear or how they behave or how they are made up, what they are made up of, and so on. So we would all feel comfortable recognizing that a dog and a cat are more similar to each other than is to a frog. And all three of them are more similar to each other than either of them is to a tick. So we also find this pattern of relatedness among species, similarity, and that needs explanation. And finally, we find that most species live independently, so they seem to be to their environments, and that is also a feature of the living world that needs explanation. To understand the diversity, the relatedness, and the adaptedness of species, this is what falls in the domain of what one might call ecology, evolutionary biology, organismal biology, animal behavior. The first set of questions about what makes a living thing alive is more in the realm of sort of cellular molecular biology, the underlying mechanisms at that reductionist level.
Right. So, another fundamental question I think I'd like to ask you is, as a evolutionary biologist, how would you define the essence of what evolutionary biology is?
I think the first most important thing to understand is that within biology, evolution has sort of a dual existence. It is, in one respect, a subdiscipline of biology in that it uses certain reasonably well defined techniques, concepts, approaches to explain things about the living world that fall within its domain of explanation of biology, in which we view all kinds of factual information about the patterns we see in the living world, whether at the molecular level or the cellular level or organismal or populational, all the way up to ecosystems. So evolution is also the perspective in which we make sense of all of that. So it's both a discipline within biology, but it is also a perspective that informs the whole of biology. And I think that is evolution to researcher. Evolution requires a constant sort of telescoping back and forth from the gory details of the nitty-gritty biology and then sort of pulling back for grander, more long-distance views, which are very conceptual and very abstract. And you need to keep doing this back and forth. And that is what I think evolution particularly challenging and, of course, therefore also particularly enjoyable.
And the last in this series of fundamental questions is, how would you define population genetics in a way that can give us some insights, some practical insights from whatever it is that you've been able to understand and about the subject?
Well, I'm not sure there are any great practical insights of looking at population genetics or indeed any subdiscipline. One is sort of what is it? The other is what does it do for us? What does it achieve? The answer is reasonably simple. I'm guessing that a lot of people today are sort of familiar with at least Mendel's basic laws of genetics.
Could you please
So
lay it out for us?
population Mendel was this. Well, at that time he was in the Austro-Hungarian Empire. The town where he lived and worked is now in the Czech Republic. The monk who was all in understanding heredity. So he did types. So he crossed seeded plant, or then he would cross a green seeded plant with a yellow seeded plant, and so on. And he observed certain regularities in how the offspring in the first generation and the next generation looked, whether they were all green seeded or all yellow seeded or some mixture of the two. And he realized that from that he inferred some principles of inheritance, which is actually a remarkable achievement, because essentially today we understand that the genes are located on chromosomes, and the way chromosomes come together in pairs and then separate during the formation of sperms or eggs or pollen in plants, the genes mirror that. But the point is that Mendel inferred this coming together and separating of genes during the formation of sperms or eggs before, almost 25, 30 years before cell division had even been described. So he inferred this from the patterns of which kinds of offspring show up in which kind of cross between which kind of parents. And so population genetics is basically an attempt to take Mendel's understanding of what happens in terms of inheritance patterns within a family, within a offspring of a single male-female pair, and extend that understanding to what happens in an entire population of organisms and how it's affected by, say, differences in the breeding system, who breeds with who, is it that relatives tend to breed, is it an inbreeding system, is it an outbreeding system, are there choices in terms of who breeds with who. And population genetics in that sense basically is an extension of Mendelian principles of genetics to the genetics and the genetic change of entire populations rather than a single family. In terms of what it achieves for us, what population genetics does, at least for those characteristics that are largely inherited through genes. For example, we also have cultural inheritance via learning and other kinds of ecological inheritance and so on. But for those characters that are inherited via gene-based inheritance, population genetics allows us to connect between how well a certain kind of organism that has certain characteristics, let's say in a population there is an individual that happens to have a bigger beak than other birds in that population. Now the question is that bigger beak perhaps makes it successful, it's better able to hunt and catch prey and so on, and therefore it's able to produce more offspring than its counterparts with the smaller beaks. But now the question is, just because it is producing more offspring, does it mean that larger beaked birds will become more common in the population over generations or not? And that is where heredity comes in. Because unless there is a very strong tendency for the offspring of this larger beaked bird to also have larger beaks will not become more common in the population. And population genetics allows us to quantify this probability. What is the chance that if you have a large beak that your offspring will also be large beak? It allows us to quantify these chances and therefore provides the hereditary link, at least for the gene-based characters, between ecological success as reflected in how many offspring you manage to have and evolutionary success in terms of whether that trait, that characteristic is going to become more and more common in the population every generation.
Okay, great. So this was something in on our channel. We are very interested in understanding from scholars and experts about their subject. That is clearly what my first three questions were about. And the other thing that we're interested in understanding is their approach towards their subject. So as I was researching and going through some of your interviews, you have said that our approach is that the question is important. Now, if you can elaborate on what you could have meant by that, and also what we are really interested to understand is what would you say makes a question important, and how can a student or just a layperson go about formulating a good question?
That's a rather interesting set of questions, and I would add a caveat right at the beginning that perhaps the answers to this will vary not just from individual to individual, but also from discipline to discipline to some extent, because different disciplines have fairly different ways of approaching questions. And so speaking for myself, when I say that the question is important, what I mean is the following. In biology, typically most people do end up doing a lot of their research on one or a few kinds of species. Some people spend their entire life working on some aspect of fruit flies, some people work on elephants, some people work on microbes, and so on. What I meant by the question is important is I am not personally particularly interested in any species as such. I happen to do all my experimental work with fruit flies in the laboratory because it turns out that fruit flies are very good systems for me to address the kinds of questions I'm interested in. Tomorrow, if I had an interesting research question and it looked to me that fruit flies are not the best system for addressing this, I would happily use a more appropriate system to address that question. So I think in that sense, to me, the question is more important than just working with a species with which you are familiar and comfortable or which you have developed some affection for and so on. So to me, my research is not about the flies, although I use fruit flies. It's about certain fundamental questions about the evolutionary process itself as a process. And the flies are a great tool to use to probe that. Just like a computer is a great tool to probe certain kinds of questions through simulation, but that doesn't mean that one is really interested in computers per se as a research topic. Right.
Interesting.
In terms of finding the right question, see, that is a long thing. In fact, that is partly what, in an ideal sense, the apprenticeship, which is what the PhD degree really is. You work closely with some researcher, and the idea is that you are an apprentice, and then you gradually become adept enough at formulating and tackling research problems that you are sort of given the driving license and told to go out and drive and do your own research. In the ideal sense, that is not how every group trains its PhDs, unfortunately. Uh, so a lot of what we try to emphasize as mentors is not just teach students techniques of how to answer questions. Um, See, the real essence of science is in posing the question well in a meaningful way. A badly posed question may never yield very profound answers. And once you have posed the question in a meaningful way, half the job is already done. Solving a properly posed question might be technologically challenging in some areas of research, might be very tedious in some areas of research, but it's essentially a technician's job in a fundamental sense. And I don't mean technician in any derogatory way at all. The scientific part of the job is actually choosing and posing the question in the most meaningful way possible that permits a good resolution of the answer. And what we try to sort of show students when we discuss problems is get them to appreciate how do you work with a problem, why do you choose a particular problem. Now obviously part of it is your interest. One of the things I'm interested in is how organisms adapt to extreme crowding, and so I choose several problems which are relevant to that field, but I also have many other interests within evolution. But apart from interest, I mean, to me, a good question should be somewhat fundamental. And again, this is just a personal perspective because I'm not that interested in a particular species or a particular set of characteristics. I'm just in the process of evolution. So to me, the question should not be something superficial about a particular species. It should explore some more general principle that illuminates some aspect of evolutionary dynamics as a process. Yeah.
Yeah. So, like we say, the question will drive the research, but these are some of the parameters that you've listed that drive the question. You're saying, or at least a question that is meaningful. And it is, you said there are things like interest, what interests you, and also what are some of the fundamental principles that question will be able to find an answer to. So these are two of the parameters you probably keep in your own mind when you're formulating a question to then follow through with, right?
Yes, absolutely. And sometimes in science, I think this is a a part of science that often the non-scientific public at large doesn't entirely appreciate what the nature of science is. See, in our discourse in society, science, at least in India, often only is heard of as the phrase science and technology, or nowadays the phrase science, technology, and innovation. But science and technology conceptually are completely different things.
Mm.
Technology is an attempt to solve real life problems, practical problems, not scientific problems, practical problems using the knowledge we have of the sciences and many other kinds of knowledge also. A science is more like an open-ended search for understanding.
Mm.
So the nature of science is such that scientific understanding keeps changing as our thinking gets more nuanced, more sophisticated. Sometimes new data arrive which cause us to change our views on something. Sometimes new concepts arise and we change our views on things. So scientific knowledge is not a static, everlasting truth. It does keep changing, it does keep amending itself as new knowledge grows, whether factual or conceptual knowledge. So one of the things also is that I find it very interesting to actually visit some of the foundational issues in our discipline in evolutionary biology, because often there are questions in those fundamental areas which have not entirely been very satisfactorily addressed. There, some consensus was reached, and then the field moved on to the next fashionable thing. But some of these core issues still are worth revisiting again and again and again and getting more insight out of it. And I always like to exemplify this with a quote from one of my favorite Urdu poets, Mirza Ghalib. So Ghalib, quoting this story about Moses going to Mount Sinai and asking God to show him a sign, said, "क्या फर्ज है कि सबको मिले एक सा जवाब, आओ ना हम भी सैर करें कोहे तूर की." So in English, this would be, the same insight is not bestowed on every contemplating soul. So let us too then take a chance and upon Mount Sinai stroll.
Mm. Beautiful. So, would you say like this way of formulating questions, because has also been your approach in your own personal life? Like, because in life also there are things we have to, of course, things we have to deal with, issues we have to overcome. So, would you say that in some sense your experience with biology, in whatever form or fashion it's shaped the way you think, has also spilled over into the way you ask questions in your own personal life?
I don't think it's specifically the biology part of being an academician or researcher that spills over. I think it's more broadly the aspect of being a researcher or a seeker after understanding,
Mm.
an academician, that spills over. And there's also a reverse spillover. I am also a fairly serious poet and have been writing poetry since I was about 17. And I'm also a serious student of poetry,
Mm.
especially in Urdu, to a more limited degree in Persian and English as well. And I think that part of my life also feeds back into the way I deal with science.
Mm.
And so I to my mind, science and poetry are not all that different. They are actually intertwined. They are both creative activities. They both are dealing with providing us simple, hopefully beautiful, metaphorical representations of reality, whether through poems or through the concepts and the mathematical models that we have in science. Both of them are metaphorical representations of reality or some aspect of reality, which we hope are also succinct and also beautiful. Um, my one attempt in life is to try to be rational as much as I can manage when trying to analyze problems in real life. I think a lot of people manage to compartmentalize things, so they're very rational and very logical and scientific when they're doing their research, but then they turn it off when they leave their labs or their offices and become fairly irrational human beings thereafter. And I think that's a bit sad. Um, we are, of course, perhaps the only country in the world whose constitution exhorts us to cultivate the scientific temper. And if we as academicians and scientists will not do that in our day-to-day lives, then it's a little bit of a stretch to expect that non-scientific people who do other kinds of jobs and professions will inculcate a scientific temper, although many of them do. So I try to be rational and analytical when I'm looking at problems in real life, and that I don't think is specifically from biology. It's from science or academics more generally.
Got it. Got it. In fact, couple of things that you've said right now are exactly the things I want to get into into detail, if possible, later. Like for one, we also spoke to another Indian physicist and mathematician, Dr. Rashna Sen, and who had a very similar way of looking at science. So, if I'm not wrong, her mother was a teacher of Urdu poetry, and they both used to sit down, yeah, and they both used to sit down and look for these similar patterns that they'll find in these two subjects. And I think they ended up concluding that at the highest level science and poetry are the same. And so if you can get into it deeper, you've already said it. In fact, one of your other quotes was that reason I enjoy doing science is because I actually see a lot of poetry in science. So now poetry and science are subjects we study in school. Sometimes we take them up as in college maybe. But to see this similarity, it's something that people might find very difficult to understand. They seem to be such, if not opposite, but fairly different disciplines in themselves. So if you can elaborate on these, what what do you mean when you say you see poetry and science?
Um, so partly, I guess, the what you said about the two often being perceived to be very different realms of activity is quite true. I get this question all the time from people I know who sort of first become acquainted with me through my poetry. So these are people with literary interests, and then they're very surprised when they hear that I'm actually a scientist. And they say, "Oh, you're a scientist? So how come you're interested in poetry?" As if it was forbidden for scientists and poets to take interest in each other's creative work.
Right.
But I think the reason the perception is that these are very different kinds of domains has a lot to do with how we encounter science in school.
Mm.
Uh, Okay, poetry also we encounter in school in slightly lackluster ways, unless you are lucky to have a good literature teacher. Uh, but poetry doesn't require you to learn a different language. You are usually reading poetry in a language you are yourself familiar with, and so on. And so it's a little bit easier to grasp what poetry is all about with a little bit of effort. With science, the problem that happens is the way we are taught science in school, it leaves the impression that this is all about facts. Uh, it's about these complicated, either very detailed biochemical explanations for the facts or very detailed mathematical explanations for the facts and phenomena, and so on. What is completely left out in the way we encounter science in school and indeed in college also is that science is not primarily about the facts. Science is primarily about our conceptualizations of the ideas we generate, the thoughts we have, the concepts we create in our heads in order to make some sense out of the patterns that we see in the manner in which the facts present themselves to us in the world around us. So, in that sense, once you appreciate that science is not about the facts, it's about how we try to, internalize patterns and cause and effect relationships among those facts in our heads, then you suddenly begin to see, well, that's exactly what poetry does, right? There are certain factual life experiences that people have, and poetry sort of abstracts from them and conceptualizes from them and creates a certain intellectual framework, which is also beautiful, just the way scientific concepts and theories are also very beautiful. And so, for example, in an Urdu poet, a very common metaphor is of the shama and the parwana, the little insect, the flying insect that circles around the candle's flame and eventually falls into it. Now, at a very prosaic level, we know why that happens, and there's nothing particularly romantic or interesting. But in Urdu poetry, shama and parwana are typically not deployed to mean this. They are deployed as a metaphor of self-sacrificing love or devotion, and so on. So you can see how the poem has taken the real experience of the moth getting burnt in the flame and abstracted some grander principle from it. And that's pretty much what science is doing too.
Beautiful, beautiful. So yes, you've said it earlier also that that for you science is not about facts. It's not even about the technologies by which we elicit those facts. It's rather about the conceptualizations, as you were saying, that we weave in our mind by which we try to explain and understand the facts and those conceptualizations, which are in many ways very aesthetic, very succinct, metaphorical representations of reality, which exactly what scientific understanding also is. This is what you were saying. This is in another place I found a similar quote with the same
Yeah,
essence.
I tend to repeat myself a lot.
No, but that only shows that that you're so clear about your stand. And what I would like to know is that would you then say that understanding reality is the pursuit of science? And if it is, then in through biology, in what way would you say, in what way has biology been able to define what reality is?
Yeah, I would completely agree with the assertion that uh, science is a way of understanding reality. Um, there are other ways of trying to understand reality, and there have been throughout the history of civilization. But many of those ways do not necessarily lend themselves to checking their validity and then revising your theories if you feel that there's a better understanding available. So many of the traditional attempts to understand reality have become very dogmatic, and they basically really don't challenge themselves, and then we start accepting them on authority. Science is a little bit different in that sense, in that it's always self-correcting, and science itself is always evolving in some sense. Uh, so with biology, I think many things about reality have we now have a much better understanding. Things that would have been mysterious sometimes even 100 years ago. For example, we now have a fairly good understanding of how is it that a single cell, a fertilized egg that results from the fusion of a sperm and an egg cell, how does that one cell eventually become a complex multicellular organism with different kinds of cells making up different kinds of tissues and so on. So, for example, how the different cell types in a growing multicellular organism, how they differentiate from each other and take on their specific characteristics. They all start off as same kind of cells. Eventually, some become kidney cells, some become skin cells, some become heart cells, some become brain cells, and so on. How does that happen? This was the topic of intense speculation uh, even about 100 years ago. and not much was known. And today we understand quite a lot about this really fascinating and very important process. Similarly, we understand a lot about how species change over time, either because of changes in the environment or otherwise also. So we understand a lot about how species evolve. We understand a lot more about how cells function. At that level, we understand a lot more today about the factors, the various factors that drive the evolution of different kinds of complex animal behaviors. We have a, I think the sophistication with which we understand, especially the living world, has improved a lot in the last 100 years or so. Having said that, I would say that it also sometimes seems that we are a little bit in danger today of drowning under an avalanche of information. Uh, for example, I am also very greatly interested in the historical development of my subjects, the history of genetics, the history of evolutionary biology, and so on. And I'm often struck by how impressive a lot of the 19th century biologists were. If you read their work, they're amazing. I mean, they're so imaginative. And sometimes I feel that today's biologists, um, it's hard to see a Darwin or a Mendel or an Ernst Haeckel in most of today's biologists. And I suspect part of the reason is we have so much information that we are a little bit, there's an element of being drowned under it, as opposed to having enough information to be able to inform your imagination. But then also your imagination is not buried under all the information. And this again reminds me of a very interesting quote from T.S. Eliot, the English language poet, who said, where is the wisdom we have lost in knowledge? Where is the knowledge we have lost in information?
Is there something else you'd like to add to what you were saying, or shall I continue?
No, that was it.
Okay, so I also know that you're interested in philosophy. So you're interested in philosophy, you're interested in poetry, and you are also a scientist. Now, if you had to, if I can call them lenses of to look at things from, how would you say that philosophy looks at what reality is? How would you say, from your own experience, poetry has been able to reveal to you what reality is or might be? And certainly you were talking about what biology has been able to help you understand of what reality is. Could you give us this elaborate picture from all these three lenses?
Okay, I would say biology helps understand what reality is, at least as far as the living world is concerned, living organisms are concerned. On the one level, a very factual understanding of what it is, and of course we weave those facts together into overarching concepts and theories and so on. But it is at one level very factual. At another level, biology provides you some very interesting, more general sorts of insights. One is about the nature of complex systems. So organisms are what is often technically called a complex system. And what we mean by that is, in simple terms, that an organism is not just complex in that it has multiple component parts. Those parts are sort of hierarchically arranged at different levels. Structurally, you can think of a hierarchy. You have molecules and macromolecules, cells, tissues, organs, organisms, populations. There's a structural hierarchy in which life forms are organized. But if you think about function, function is very integrative across multiple levels. Function doesn't have that kind of a hierarchy to that extent. In certain respects, it does. But a lot of functionality is actually integrated across structural levels. And this has implications for how we try to understand functionality. This is one of the interesting things to me that biology has taught me. The other thing with complex systems is that not only are there so many interacting components which are hierarchical, they feed back upon themselves in all kinds of complicated networks. So cause and effect in a complex system in a living organism is very rarely linear. Cause and effect is more like circular. A causes B, but B in turn also affects A. And both of them affect C, which feeds back on D, which again affects A, B, and C. So it's not simple, this caused that, that caused that. It's not a linear chain of cause and effect. And in all of these kinds of so-called complex systems, one of the interesting thing is that you have what we call emergent properties. In other words, at one level of organization, there will be some properties that the system exhibits, which you cannot really understand just as being the result of the properties of the lower level units. And what this, of course, means is that when you are dealing with complex systems, reductionism is somewhat limited in how far it will take you as an analytical approach. Some important set of questions will have to be addressed in a more holistic manner. This is again a very strong message from biology. The third thing I have learned from biology really is that in the living world, almost everything is always context specific. There are very few grand principles in biology, the way they are, for example, in many physical laws, which are universally applicable. In biology, things are always very context specific. And understanding how that context specificity plays out in any given situation is again part of the things that make biology very challenging and also very interesting. From the philosophy point of view, I should say upfront, I have never formally been a student of philosophy. So I have tended to read and think about some areas of philosophy which are of interest to me, as opposed to studying the subject in a formal way. I am particularly interested in philosophy primarily from the perspective of the philosophy of science. That is to say, an inquiry into how science is done rather than what is it we do when we do scientific research, but why we do it that way. What are the implicit assumptions that go into doing any piece of scientific research? Usually, we are not even aware of all the assumptions we are making. I'm also somewhat interested in the area of philosophy called epistemology, which deals with sort of how we construct knowledge. What is a proof? What is a demonstration? What is an explanation? What is a description? Things like that. And again, I'm interested in all of this, particularly as it pertains to science. And I think what my reading and thinking in philosophy has helped me with is it helps me from time to time to step outside my role as being a scientist, where I am busy doing science, step out of that into the realm of philosophy, which is a broader realm than science, and look in as an outsider and say, is this the best way of addressing this set of questions? Are there hidden assumptions that I have made when addressing this question, which if I made a different set of assumptions, maybe the way I would address this question would be very different.
Right.
So from time to time, philosophy helps me step outside of science and look back at what I am doing as a scientist and trying to think if there are different or better ways of doing it. I also have some interest in logic, obviously, as a scientist and so on. But yeah, so I'm not very much interested in classical metaphysics in the philosophical sense, which is philosophizing about the nature of reality. I have some interest in that, but I don't think those things have influenced the way I work at all. It's more these issues in epistemology that have actually influenced the way I work. Coming back to poetry, I think poetry, the biggest way in which it directly influences the way one does science, poetry gives you this ability which you develop as you read a lot and you start writing poetry yourself and so on. You gradually develop this ability that you take a certain experience or a certain fact of life or a certain phenomenon in life or whatever, and from that experience you pull out its abstract core. You ignore the unnecessary details of that experience to a large degree. You pull out the abstract core and then you express it in some really beautiful phrases, some good metaphors, some interesting similes, and so on. So, this aspect of abstracting some core from any real experience, I think, is what is very common in poetry and science, because that's what we're doing when we're doing science also. We are trying to abstract something from real observations, real data, but then hopefully use it to make some interesting and beautiful generalization.
Right.
So I think both poetry and science rely quite a lot on inductive reasoning, going from the specific to the general. And that, I think, is where poetry directly uh, informs science. And also, I think if you are a poet, uh, you also seek a certain aesthetic quality in the science you do or in the scientific papers that you write. Um, I'm always overjoyed if somebody who reads a paper of mine says that they found it very well written, in addition to having an interesting experiment or an interesting concept described in it. There are experimental designs which are amazingly beautiful, and you read somebody's paper and they have this particularly elegant experimental design that cleaves out the problem into neat solutions, and you just read it and you give wah wah kya experiment hai, just like you would after hearing a great couplet in a mushaira. So, yeah.
Right, right. Well, that's very beautiful, Professor. Thank you. Thank you for sharing that. And there's a different question, a little different in its essence from where we were going so far. So you've spent a bit of time, I think, as a student in America, and then, of course, as a student and an academic in India. Would you be able to cite out some of the differences in the ways scientists of the two countries approach science, and how also the facilitators in each of these countries look at their positions as teachers and mentors?
Okay, I'll take the second one first because it's a bit simpler, and I will add the caveat that again, uh, mentoring styles within even just biology tend to be very different in different areas of biology. And this difference I saw both in the US when I was a grad student and postdoc and in India. Uh, the manner in which PhD students are handled by their research supervisors is a little different in ecology and evolution and behavior. There, the tendency is a lot more of, it's your PhD, you figure out what you want to do, I'll help you. Talk to me when you want to discuss stuff. But it's your PhD, and you are the guy who's going to have to figure out what you're doing. In molecular cellular biology, reductionist biology, even in America, it's not like that. It's more like I have this gigantic NSF project. This guy in the lab is already cloning the gene. You need to characterize the patterns of gene expression, and then you'll get your degree. It's more like that. I mean, these are slightly exaggerated caricatures. And obviously, these are two ends of a spectrum. But ecology evolution labs would cluster on one side of the spectrum with a few crossovers. Uh, Reductionist biology is a little bit on the other side of the spectrum. And this difference I find in India also to a reasonable degree. One thing which I found was very different between India and the US uh, was the attitude of how professors interacted with students. And please bear in mind, when I left India to go to the US for my doctoral work, I had not been a research scholar in India. I had only studied up to MSc.
Mhm.
And my perception at university was that, most professors, with one exception in my case, were not really interested in interacting much with students. They were somewhere up there, on a pedestal, and students were down there. And so on.
Mhm.
And the thing I liked when I went to the US, although there I was a PhD student, not a master's student, but I think this generalizes to a reasonable degree, is that your professors treated you as an intellectual equal. Yes, perhaps a more inexperienced scholar compared to them, a younger scholar, but they treated you as their intellectual equal, the way they discussed things. That I found really most enjoyable, very impressive, and very admirable. Uh, in India, I will say that again, it varies from individual to individual and to some extent discipline to discipline. There are very interesting mentors in India also. Perhaps they're not as many as they should ideally be. Ideally, everybody should be an excellent mentor, but we also understand that the world is not ideal. But at least, it should be more of the norm to be a mentor who treats students as intellectual equals and engages with them at that with that sort of familiarity and equality. And I should add that treating students as intellectual equals is not achieved simply by insisting, like the Americans in India, that your student should call you by first name. I know lots of labs where students call their PIs by first name, but they are not permitted to argue on scientific matters with their PI. And I know other labs where students refer to their PI as sir, but feel free enough to argue and disagree on scientific matters. And I think the second one is more important.
Mhm.
The first one is more for show.
Mhm.
Uh,
Right. Right.
so that's one difference. In terms of the first part of your question, I'm sorry, I forgot one nuance in that question. Could you just tell me what that was again?
Wait, how the academics of the two countries approach science?
Huh. So this actually, you see, I didn't find too much difference on an average. Uh, there are individuals in the US I have known and worked with who approach science in fairly unique and very interesting ways, and the same is true for India. On an average, I didn't see much difference, and I personally think, if you'll allow me to just elaborate on this for a couple of minutes, I think
Sure.
that's a tragedy. Um, when I read papers, even papers written in English in my field that date from before World War II, uh, I can usually make out, even if you cover up the author's name and their affiliations, I can usually make out whether it's from England or America, or it's a paper from Germany, or it's a paper from Russia, or it's a paper from France. Because there were differences in the way they did and wrote about their science, at least in biology. I'm assuming perhaps there were similar differences in other disciplines also. Post World War II, and especially today, if you cover up the author list, there is no way you can read a paper in biology and make even a wildly likely guess whether it's an American paper, British paper, German paper, French paper, Chinese paper, Indian paper, Iranian paper. They all read the same. There has been a tremendous homogenization of how we do science and how we think about science, more importantly. See, how we do science in the very narrow technical experimental sense, obviously the way you do an experiment, the machine you use is not going to differ with culture. But the way we do science in our heads, the way we think about the questions, how we choose our questions, how we choose to characterize our questions, how we choose to delineate our questions, how we choose to approach the strategy for answering them, in those kinds of things what are the philosophical underpinnings of how we approach biological questions. In all those things, science has become extremely homogenized and, if I might say so, extremely Americanized in the post-World War II era. And that is also partly true of culture in general. There's a lot of cultural homogenization also happening around the world, you know.
Right.
McDonald's everywhere, Starbucks everywhere, everybody trying to be as American as they possibly could, etc. In science, I think this is a tragedy because while obviously there are certain commonalities that will be followed, I mean, the scientific method is what it is. There's no Indian scientific method versus European scientific method or anything. But I think it's a loss if the way in which our own culture and specifically our own intellectual traditions do not at all inform the way we think about science. I think that's a loss, personally. Yeah.
So this is very interesting, Professor, this observation of yours, because we asked a similar question to an Indian physicist, Dr. Professor Rajesh Gopakumar, and what he said was he said that when the Americans are doing science, and he was, of course, coming from the point of view of physics, that they are more creative, they're very handy, they like to create things, uh, something to that effect. And when Indians are entering science at large, right, because of our, let's say, our religious background and how a lot of us are brought up in our own families, maybe like you're saying, that's changing now, or something like that, that we would like to see a bigger picture, that we enter with a hope to finding answers to a bigger picture. This was his observation, but yours are slightly different, I would say, right?
Um, okay, I should say I know Professor Gopakumar quite well.
Hmm.
Uh, um, I think some of this difference in perception actually comes from the fields within one works. He's a theoretical physicist.
Right.
Theoretical physics is a field which is quite strong in India. There's a lot of amazingly high quality stuff being done in India in theoretical physics. And I think they have a deeper roots in terms of modern physics in India. I mean, you think about a lot of our slightly older British era great scientists, most of them were physicists. C.V.
Right.
Raman, S.N. Bose,
Mm-hmm.
and the others. So I think theoretical physicists, partly by training, are also, encouraged to look for the bigger picture. Within biology, perspectives again differ quite sharply on an average between reductionist biologists and ecologists, evolutionary biologists on the other hand. I think looking for the bigger picture is not a good general characterization. It is perhaps characterizes much of the biological community very well. I certainly don't think it characterizes most of the reductionist biology community in India at all. I
Mm.
mean, by very definition, people who have a reductionist view of biology are rather explicitly not looking for the big picture. They're looking for the really detailed small picture, which is fine. I mean, that's a legitimate approach to take. Again, I'm not trying to put it down. Within ecology and evolution, I think it's a more mixed bag in India. There are some who are a little bit more interested in the details of the species or the system with which they are engaged as researchers.
Yeah, I think yeah, I understand what you're saying. So somewhere the status of the discipline is also defining the approach you take towards it, right?
Oh, very much so, because the disciplines are very different. I mean, um, biology is not physics. Biology is not chemistry. Even though you occasionally hear professors starting their talks in molecular biology by saying all biology is basically chemistry. I mean, that's not really the case. In fact, once you have done all your reductionism down to the chemistry level and you remove all that, what remains is the biology. The biology doesn't really even get addressed by. See, you can explain what certain molecules are doing within a cell on the basis of chemical principles. That
Mm.
is correct. But that doesn't mean that biology is reducible to chemistry.
Mm.
It just means that you can explain certain attributes and behaviors of biological molecules that are found within living cells
Mm.
on the basis of the laws of chemistry, which is obvious. I mean,
Mm.
everything, including living organisms and their components, have to follow the laws of physics and chemistry, right?
Mm.
That's a given. That's a set of constraints within which every life form operates.
Mm.
How do they get around those constraints and function within those constraints? That's where all the biology is, and that is not reducible to physics and chemistry. So every discipline does have its own perspective,
Mm.
and sometimes the perspectives match more closely across disciplines in a very strange way. It's a almost universal experience of most of us who work in ecology and evolution, that it is much easier to talk about the work we do and explain the work we do to fellow academicians who are physicists rather than to fellow academicians who are molecular or cellular biologists.
Okay.
Now, on the face of it, this seems ironic.
Mm.
Shouldn't another biologist understand what I do more easily than a physicist does?
Mm.
But actually, it turns out that the way physicists view the nature of scientific explanation as a model versus explanation as a description, in that a lot of ecology and evolution actually matches more closely with the way physicists try to construct explanations, and that is why I think it's easier to talk to them about science
Got it.
compared to talking to a chemist or a molecular biologist.
Got it. Got it. So this is another thing that I wanted to know from you. Is I think it'll my next question will fit into what you were attempting to explain. In one of your other talks, you spoke about something called interdisciplinary thinking. Now, this was in context of how biology can your understanding of biology can feed into physics, your understanding of physics or maths can feed into biology. But what I am this phrasing interdisciplinary thinking, it was very catchy, and I became really curious to understand it better from you. As in, what does it mean? If you can explain us what you meant by interdisciplinary thinking, and what are some of the processes you've used to develop this kind of a thinking in your own mind, in your own life, and what kind of value has it brought to you personally and professionally, developing this kind of interdisciplinary thinking, as you call it?
Okay. Uh, First off, I would just like to say something about the context in which I made this remark.
Hmm.
Uh, See, nowadays, interdisciplinarity has become a buzzword in science. And
Right.
certainly in Indian science, everybody is, oh, you have to be interdisciplinary. And the idea of interdisciplinarity that they have, implicitly, if not explicitly, is that you need to create collaborative research groups where you have a physicist, a chemist, a structural biologist, a bioinformatics guy, and they all work together in an interdisciplinary way. That's what the science establishment or the science funding agencies or the administrators have in mind most of the time when they talk about interdisciplinarity. Uh, my comment was a counterpoint to that, saying we should also recognize that it's important for individuals to be more interdisciplinary in their own thinking.
Right.
I should be able to think not just as a classically trained geneticist, but as an evolutionary biologist, as an ecologist, as a physicist, as a mathematician, as a bioinformatician. I should be able to think in all these ways, ideally as one individual. And I think that's very important. And I think that is not talked about at all in India when we keep, shouting about interdisciplinarity. I could be doing very interesting interdisciplinary research without ever having a collaboration with anybody else because my own thinking is interdisciplinary. Uh,
Yes. Yes, I understand.
so
Hmm.
So that was the context. How this happens is, I think there are multiple influences. My father was a mathematician. So when I was a kid growing up, we grew up around quite a few really good mathematicians who were family friends and so on. And so then much later, when I was a PhD student and a postdoc, I had three mentors. During my PhD, one of my PhD supervisors was a field ecologist. The other was a mathematician. And my postdoc mentor was experimental evolutionary biologist who worked with fruit flies in the lab. And I think I got a remarkable opportunity to learn how to approach problems as an ecologist, as an evolutionist, as a theoretician from these mentors. And I could clearly see that the way in which if you go to them as a student, if I would go to them and say, this is the problem and I'm getting stuck, the kind of advice and the way they would give advice actually differed quite a lot. And so along this path, one thing I realized that one must really pick up from the way mathematicians look at things is to develop, it takes time, obviously, an ability to decide what is irrelevant detail and eliminate it from the picture and focus on what is logically crucial to the problem. So convert the problem into a logical structure first by getting rid of unnecessary details. And of course, how you develop that ability as to which detail is necessary or unnecessary requires you to have studied that system as an empiricist for a long time. So these things all play into each other. Ecologists often look at evolutionary questions in a different way than people classically trained as geneticists do. So I think what is important is that uh, while it is true that we are all prisoners of our background training and our experiences, I think it's important for us to transcend the shackles of our disciplinary backgrounds and open our ways to thinking about problems and how you tackle them from multiple different fields. And in some cases, it also involves absorbing tools from multiple different fields. And the tools could be experimental or they could be conceptual. Yeah.
Yeah, so Professor, just a little bit longer on this. So I might take a bit to explain what I'm trying to say. So thinking is in itself an act of effort. It requires effort to think a thought through, to hold a thought. It requires effort, and of course, it requires practice. And then on top of it, we're talking about holding. In your case, you're also able to bringing philosophical thinking to your work. You're able to bring in your perhaps lessons that you picked up from poetry in terms of aesthetics, in terms of meter, in terms of rhythm, whatever they might be, into your work. And these ways of thinking, these modes of thinking coexist in your mind. So now that's for that to happen, I think it is a result of a certain kind of a mental evolution in you, and in some, and I've seen this in some other people as well, who are able to hold diverse thoughts in their minds and kind of string them together in a way that the picture that they present is so amazing because of the connections they've been able to make. For me, that is basically the essence of a creative expression. So now, what does this tell us about evolution? Because I would always see evolution as a universal thing. So a coconut tree here is very likely going to be very, very similar to a coconut tree somewhere else in the world. It'll have its some adaptive tendencies where it might differ a bit here and there, but essentially I would be able to recognize it. But in terms of this, like how certain some of us are able to develop this, taking this as an example only, this interdisciplinary thinking, keeping various modes of thought in your mind and not getting bogged down with them, but being able to juggle with them effectively. Some people are able to do it, some people are not able to do it. Now, would you say that in the case of human ideas, thoughts, and emotions, that there is something much more fundamental that's driving this sophistication further, would you say it is the reason for this would be willpower? Um, wha- was I able to make myself clear, Professor?
First of all, I don't think evolution has anything to do with the fact that some humans are able to think in certain ways better than perhaps some others. Um, uh, it's simply an expression of the fact that I mean humans, of course, have a greatly flexible behavioral repertoire, if you like. We learn, we are very flexible in altering our behaviors, and so on. Now, it's also an expression of the fact that individuals in any species, in any population, even though they are, as you said, recognizably of the same species, but they do vary from one another. And uh, in the case of the ways in which we think, the variation could be in part due to small differences in our biologies of maybe how our brains function. It would be very, very heavily influenced by early influences, cultural, I mean, non-biological, environmental, cultural, the social environment, those influences as we grow up. And especially there, see the way the brain um, forms interconnections within itself as a child is growing up. The richness of the cognitive environment the child is growing up in seems to play a huge role. So all those things are going to feed into it, but I would imagine that most of the differences are due to experiences you have in childhood, uh, and so on. Uh, But what you said about, people stringing seemingly disparate things together and coming up with an interesting conjunction, I think that is at the heart of many great scientific ideas that have happened over the years also. It's, I mean, the really big scientific breakthroughs are relatively rarely because somebody discovered new data. It's more commonly because somebody saw the data everybody else had, but saw connections that other people had not seen,
Right.
and then created some new conceptualization out of it.
Mm-hmm. Right, right. In one of your other interviews, you also said that a lot of nice science happens when you follow your curiosity. Now, this is something I found common after speaking to mathematicians, linguists, certainly physicists. They follow in the footsteps of their curiosity, so to speak. Now, and it takes them somewhere. There is a place waiting for them to get to, and they get there thanks to their curiosity. And maybe there is a bit of intuition involved also. But for this question here, I'm more interested in understanding about curiosity. So not only in terms of where it led you, but that's for anyone to see through the work that has been published, through the papers that you've published, through the breakthroughs that you've been able to make. But what I'm interested in understanding is through this experience with your curiosity in allowing it to lead you, what would you say you've understood about the nature of curiosity itself?
So, I mean, that's actually a really interesting question, and I haven't thought about this too much. So, I'm going to be thinking on the fly as I speak.
Sure.
Um, I think, you see, the thing about curiosity, if we try to analyze it and strip it of sort of the more romantic notions that surround it, I think curiosity is at least in part about appreciating patterns. First of all, that's a prerequisite, because what you notice when you are curious is something about the pattern that doesn't seem to fit the pattern that well. And then you say, hey, wait a minute, this was the pattern. What's this little thing doing here? That's weird. And that's weird, as in it's not following the pattern that I expected. That is what curiosity really is. It's that's weird. Uh, and as has been said, most scientific discoveries are not preceded by eureka, they are preceded by, oh, that's weird. Um, Now, why do I say that the pattern part of it is because obviously what all of us, including people who are not necessarily being seen as being greatly creative, all of us have a great ability, along with almost everything else in biology, to assess change in a state, in a situation, rather than assess the actual situation. We register change as living things. Uh, you don't necessarily register temperatures outside in the acutely. If the temperature changes by 5 degrees, you register it far more acutely than if it was high or low at those levels. It's the change which we pick up on. And this is, I think, a general biological tendency. Now, given that we are so sensitive to change, and all of us are, why is it that some of us see more interesting kinds of changes in more diverse kinds of patterns than others? Also known as, why do some people appear to be more creative? I think there the thing is that by virtue again of your background, your exposure to different kinds of cognitively rich or not so rich environments as a child, your disciplinary training and so on, many people are better placed simultaneously at different levels across different domains and so on. So I think the difference in creativity, and this is just a hypothesis
Sure.
of mine, which as I said, I'm thinking on the fly. But I suspect that perhaps a lot of what we think of as differences in creativity among people might be differences in how comfortable they are with thinking of diverse kinds of patterns at the same time.
Mhm.
The ability to spot discrepancies in the pattern and go, oh, that's really weird, that I think is pretty strong in everybody.
Mm.
The difference perhaps is in how complex are the patterns we
Mm.
have learned and trained ourselves to identify, and therefore we see discrepancies in a much bigger domain, and then it looks like, oh my god, this guy is really creative. This is my guess.
Very interesting. Thank you, Professor. I think we just have two more questions to ask you. So, what I was saying, like I've already shared with you that we've spoken with mathematicians, linguists, and physicists, and among them, philosophers of each of these subjects. Now,
Mhm.
all of them had something to say about what they find compelling and beautiful about these subjects that they studied. Now, I'd like to know from you if there is an idea or perhaps an essence of biology that you find beautiful and sublime.
Well, at one level, if you look at biology as a discipline, what could be more beautiful and sublime than living organisms themselves? And pretty much everything they do, including how they develop from a fertilized egg into a complex multicellular organism which does all kinds of things, has a complex structure, complex functionality, and so on. So, the very subject matter of biology itself is extremely beautiful and sublime if you think of it that way. There are also a couple of principles that emerge from this, and one is that how a self organizing system like an organism can utilize a fairly limited toolbox, if you like, in order to create an astonishing diversity of life forms. But all of these life forms are generated from a fertilized egg using a toolkit which is actually somewhat limited. And this manner of creating complexity out of simplicity while using a relatively limited toolkit, I think is one of the more beautiful things in biology. When it comes to how studying biology has influenced one's worldview, I think a couple of things stand out. Things that biology sort of makes very obvious to us. One is the notion of unity in diversity. Life forms are very diverse, but at a lower level are made up of fairly similar entities called cells and so on. If we look at a principle which emerges through a study of experimental evolution, when you do multi-generation experiments for hundreds of generations, you appreciate that another principle that sort of pops out from biology is unity in ends and diversity in means. So, for example, if you challenge a population with, let us say, extreme levels of crowding, even fairly similar related populations can evolve to deal with the challenge of crowding, but through evolving slightly different adaptations. And these differences can be due to small differences in the initial genetic makeup of those populations, or also small differences in how the crowding was actually experienced. So even though the end result is the same, you evolve to be better at surviving and reproducing under crowded conditions. The means by which you do so, the characteristics that you evolve in order to achieve that end, can vary from population to population. So there's unity in ends and diversity in means. And this you see all over the living world. Biology is full of this kind of thing. Another thing I think that biology teaches us very strongly is that lots of things in the living world, which obviously includes us humans, are extremely context specific. There are relatively few absolutes in biology. Things are extremely context specific, and I think that's a good thing to keep in mind during life too. And finally, one thing that biology, I think, really emphasizes to us when we get deeper into it, that variation from individual to individual, or diversity among the different individuals that all belong to the same species or the same population, that diversity is important in and of itself. It's not just statistical noise around either the quality of that type or some kind of measure of central tendency like an average. It's not noise around an ideal type. That variation is biological reality, that diversity is biological reality, and it is important on its own terms and in its own right. It is, after all, that variation, when it is inheritable, that provides the raw material that the evolutionary process also acts on. So I think the importance of diversity is another thing that biology emphasizes to us rather vividly when we study it.
My conversation with Professor Joshi reinforced the importance of how a subject is introduced to a student, especially from the point of view of the lifelong impact that introductory experience can leave on the student. It also showed me how science is essentially about making one's observations as articulate as possible, since the answers we get are the questions we ask. It would be wonderful to know your thoughts on the conversation and if it inspired your worldview in any way. Thanks for being here. I will see you soon with another interesting mind demystifying another interesting subject. Until then, take care.